Jason stepped outside to find his mailbox ripped from its post, replaced by a cold metal box miles away, his connection to home severed overnight. Furious and powerless, he stared at the silent streets, knowing this was just the start of a quiet war nobody saw coming. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Jason Miller stood frozen on the cracked concrete sidewalk, the early sunlight casting long, sharp shadows across the neat rows of identical houses lining Maplewood Drive. His gaze locked onto the stark, sterile metal box, now anchored rigidly in place of his familiar wooden mailbox. A box that looked like it belonged in a government facility rather than a neighborhood that once prided itself on charm and personal touches. The abruptness of the change left him breathless. The mailbox was more than just a receptacle for letters and packages. It was a quiet emblem of his life's rhythm, a small but consistent marker of home. For 15 years, Jason had started his mornings walking just a few steps from his porch to retrieve bills, birthday cards, and occasional notes from neighbors. That ritual was his tether to this community, a rhythm that grounded him amid life's chaos. Now, that tether was severed, replaced by a cold, impersonal gesture from faceless authority figures who decided to rearrange his world without a single word of consultation. His hands clenched into fists, the raw sting of indignation simmering beneath his skin. The HOA's decision had not come from nowhere. Karen Evans, the neighborhood's self-appointed gatekeeper, had been waging a silent war against what she labeled visual clutter and liability hazards. A former city planner with a laser focus on regulations, Karen believed Maplewood Drive should resemble the sanitized subdivisions she once helped design: orderly, uniform, and predictable. Her rationale was airtight on paper. Mailboxes scattered along sidewalks created dangerous bottlenecks, distracted drivers, and muddled the streetscape's aesthetic coherence. Yet Jason couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the guise of community safety lay a deeper impulse, a thirst for control. The HOA's unilateral action betrayed the fundamental trust residents had placed in their leadership. They were supposed to be stewards of the neighborhood's well-being, not tyrants imposing arbitrary mandates. Jason's voice rose in his mind, fueled by the shock of the mailbox's disappearance and the audacity of its replacement. How could they justify stripping away such a personal, harmless piece of his daily life? How many other small freedoms would fall next under Karen's reign? His frustration escalated when Jason noticed the cluster of relocated mailboxes, lined up like cold soldiers just a few yards from his home, sharing space with every other residence. The absence of choice stung deeply. The HOA had lumped everyone together, erasing individuality for the sake of a bland sameness. And then there was the absurd final blow, the USPS's decision to reinstall mailboxes not along the curb, but right at the complex's front entrance. A practical nightmare. For Jason, whose mobility was limited after a recent ankle injury, this new setup was not just inconvenient. It was a needless hardship inflicted without consideration. The more he thought about it, the more the injustice felt personal. It wasn't merely about the mailbox. It was about respect, dignity, and the principle that even small acts mattered in defining a community. Jason's anger was not the fleeting irritation of inconvenience. It was a slow-burning fire fueled by betrayal and a growing resolve. This was his home, his sanctuary, and no bureaucratic decree was going to dictate how he accessed his own mail without a fight. As he stood there, fists still clenched and jaw tight, Jason's mind churned through possibilities. Would the HOA listen if he spoke up? Or would they dismiss him like everyone else? The sudden shock of waking to find his mailbox gone had twisted into a furious determination. He refused to let this petty tyranny slide unnoticed. This was only the beginning. Jason's fury, once a searing blaze, had gradually settled into a dull ache that gnawed at the edges of his days and invaded his nights. The initial shock of the mailbox's removal had been replaced by a creeping, corrosive sense of injustice. Each delayed delivery, every misdirected package, Each vanished letter became a fresh wound, a constant reminder of the tangled bureaucracy that had reshaped his daily life without consent. He found himself lingering near the new cluster of mailboxes, watching neighbors approach with wary hesitation, as if approaching some cold, unfamiliar monument, rather than a trusted fixture of home. Conversations on the block grew tense and wary. Neighbors exchanged furtive complaints, sharing stories of lost mail, late bills, and mounting frustration. Yet few dared to openly confront the HOA. The association's rigid facade seemed impenetrable, its leadership cloaked in an unyielding veneer of authority. Calls to the board devolved into dead ends, polite, scripted responses that skirted responsibility and dismissed concerns as trivial. Karen's message was clear and unrelenting. Uniformity preserved property values and community pride. Any deviation was selfish, disruptive, and ultimately harmful to all. To Jason, it felt less like a policy and more like an indictment of his very right to question authority. At home, the weight of the ordeal settled heavily between him and Lisa. She watched the changes erode his usual calm, the lines around his eyes deepening with each passing day. Lisa's voice, steady yet gentle, urged patience, reminding him that battles were best fought with strategy, not fury. Yet she understood the toll, the restless nights, the way Jason's mind circled endlessly around the injustice. Their home, once a refuge, now felt touched by the strain, a place where quiet frustration lingered like an unwelcome shadow. In the face of mounting frustration, a sliver of hope began to glimmer. Jason, reluctant at first, started knocking on doors, gathering signatures from neighbors who shared his sense of betrayal. To his surprise, many residents welcomed the chance to voice their discontent, though most had remained silent out of fear of retribution, of social isolation, or simply being dismissed. His list grew steadily, a quiet but tangible testament to a community simmering beneath the surface, united not just by addresses, but by shared indignation. The real turning point came at the next community meeting. The room buzzed with the usual polite civility, the air thick with restrained tension. When Jason rose to speak, he did so not as a lone agitator, but as the collective voice of those silenced. His words were measured yet resolute, laying bare the practical hardships imposed by the HOA's decisions and the emotional fracture it created. He spoke of lost mail, daily inconveniences, and above all, the erosion of trust between residents and their elected leaders. Karen's steely demeanor cracked ever so slightly as murmurs rippled through the crowd. Unexpectedly, some board members exchanged hesitant glances, their rigid loyalty wavering. The room, previously dominated by Karen's iron will, felt the faint tremors of dissent. The unanimity she had once wielded like a shield began to show fractures, small openings for change. Meanwhile, the USPS representatives, caught in the bureaucratic crossfire, offered a cautious olive branch. Bound by regulations but sympathetic to residents' plight, they proposed a temporary solution, reinstating mailboxes at their original locations, if only the HOA would grant approval. This concession, though conditional, was a beacon of possibility, a glimpse of light amid the growing shadows of discontent. For Jason, the pain of injustice remained raw, but in that room, surrounded by neighbors slowly finding their voices and allies emerging from unexpected quarters, hope stirred. The battle was far from over, but the first cracks had formed in the HOA's imposing armor. And with those cracks came the fragile promise that change might yet be possible. Jason stood at the threshold of change, the momentum of community resolve coursing through him like an electric current. His initial fury had transformed into focused determination, a strategic clarity that galvanized not only his neighbors, but the very structures that had once seemed immutable. The formal petition he organized was more than a list of grievances. It was a meticulously crafted manifesto, each argument buttressed with empirical evidence, photographs, and first-hand accounts demonstrating the tangible disruptions caused by the forced relocation of mailboxes. Jason's proposal dissected the HOA's rationale with surgical precision, revealing that the promised gains in safety and aesthetics were, at best, unsubstantiated claims, and at worst, a veneer for control that disregarded the lived realities of residents. Central to his strategy was the legal counsel he secured, an attorney well-versed in HOA governance and property law, who elucidated the limits of the association's authority. The attorney's analysis clarified that the unilateral decision to move mailboxes without homeowner consent bordered on overreach, exposing the HOA to potential legal challenges. This newfound clarity emboldened Jason and his supporters. Their fight was not just moral, but anchored in legal precedent. Armed with this, Jason approached the next HOA meeting with a dossier of evidence and the quiet confidence of one who had shifted the balance of power. The atmosphere at the meeting was palpably different. The once rigid and unyielding Karen Evans, the HOA's architect of the mailbox relocation, faced the assembled residents and board members not as an unchallengeable authority, but as a leader confronted with the limits of unilateral control. In a moment that underscored the complexity of leadership and human frailty, Karen admitted that her motivations stemmed from a genuine desire to uphold neighborhood standards. Her admission carried the weight of reluctant vulnerability. She acknowledged that her rigid stance had been devoid of empathy and that the process had overlooked the very people it purported to serve. This confession did not erase the conflict, but opened a fissure for dialogue, a recognition that governance without listening was governance doomed to fracture. In response to mounting community pressure and the undeniable strength of Jason's case, the HOA relented. The decision was made to restore mailboxes to their original locations, a concession that, while seemingly small, resonated deeply. Jason's mailbox was repositioned at the curb outside his home, a tangible restoration of normalcy and respect. This victory transcended mere convenience. It symbolized the reclaiming of agency by homeowners whose voices had been marginalized. The restoration marked the beginning of a new chapter for the community, where transparency and mutual respect replaced opacity and unilateral edicts. The impact rippled beyond the physical repositioning of mailboxes. Jason's struggle sparked ongoing dialogue between the HOA board and residents, fostering an environment where open communication and accountability became the new norm. The precedent set by this episode fortified the community's resolve to resist arbitrary impositions and assert their rights as stakeholders. It was a reminder that even the smallest elements of daily life, mailboxes, sidewalks, streetlights, were integral threads in the fabric of communal trust. Jason's journey resonated far beyond his quiet suburban street. His tenacity became emblematic of the broader fight against petty, often overlooked injustices that erode personal dignity and communal harmony. He demonstrated that principled persistence, coupled with solidarity and informed action, could dismantle walls of bureaucratic arrogance and restore justice, no matter how minor the initial grievance seemed. In his quiet triumph, Jason inspired others to confront their own battles with courage and clarity, proving that change is forged not only in grand revolutions, but in steadfast insistence on fairness in the everyday.